The answers to unanswered questions.
But in that quest, in that search,
God and the Word were found.
Does the fabled Ark of the Covenant still exist? And are the Ten Commandments still inside? Will we ever know who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? And why? We'll never understand the mysteries of those. That's simply not possible. But we can try. These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible.
Earth, home, hospitable, harsh. As far as you can see, humans had a need to come to grips with happenings beyond their capacity to understand and beyond their control. Gods of wind, of love, of war. Many gods. And then, some 4,000 years ago, there arose a new idea. Single God, above all. This was the Word, passed in the telling from generation to generation. But those who conveyed the Word, the people of that long ago time, would leave us the great Western religions, would leave little else behind to tell us who they were.
We're no longer looking just for kings and political events, but how did the ordinary man and woman live? What was their life like? These are the kinds of new questions that are being asked, and the answers are very exciting.
Are excited about this line of research for a simple reason. While most of us think of the Bible as a book of religious faith, it is increasingly clear that at least part of the Bible actually is a true chronicle of history.
We're reading Bible with archaeology. Very often what we find is that it shows us that the Bible was set in the historical context of its time. It shows us most of the things in the Bible can have happened the way they are told. The greatest mystery right now is simply understanding who we're being. reaching up from the ancient stones and out across time, the echo of humanity that still touches us today. And the second angel cried out, "Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees." Revelations 7. You shall not lord your fellow, you shall not robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. Leviticus 19. Let he who is without sin among you cast the first stone. John 8. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? Exodus.
Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. Matthew 2. Am I my brother's keeper? Genesis 4. No.
It is understood that what is known as the Bible is in fact two very different works, written in two entirely different eras. The Old Testament is an historical document detailing the creation of man and the early years of Hebrew struggle, exile, and civilization. The Old Testament was probably first written down sometime between 1000 and 500 before Christ. At that time, the world was already a busy place. Egyptian civilization had begun its long decline, and Greek culture began to flower. In China, geometry, algebra, and the theory of motion were being born, while across the great Pacific, Native American people were first building huts of wood and reed. The Old Testament, with its stories of Adam and Eve, Noah, Moses, and the Israelites in the Promised Land, has been revered throughout the ages by Jew and Christian alike. But sometime in the first 100 years after the death of Christ, the New Testament began to take form, with its telling of Jesus, his teachings, his birth, and his death. More than 1,000 years separated Christ from the Middle Ages, when the Bible was finally compiled as we now know it. Just as more than 1,000 years separated Christ from Moses. And so scholars would spend lifetimes studying a biblical text that was influenced by the ideas and prejudices of the Middle Ages. It was an exercise in frustration and thinking. All of this was about to change in 1947 with one of the most dramatic discoveries of the 20th century. A discovery which would give us a looking glass into the very origins of Jewish and Christian faith. While herding his sheep on a blistering afternoon among rugged cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, a young Bedouin boy known as Mahmoud Wolf came upon the mouth of an all but inaccessible cave. Wondering what was inside, he picked up a stone and tossed it gently into the cave's mouth, and heard something shatter. The sound of pottery being broken. Something else was demolished that day. Something which has never been put back together. For what Mahmoud the Wolf was about to discover would stun the world. Scattered and spread over 4 caves were dozens of large jars and urns. What they protected from the ravages of time had been lying in wait for almost 2,000 years. the Dead Sea Scrolls.
When I first sat down and looked at the hundreds and hundreds of photographs of the unpublished scrolls that I had now access to, you can imagine I felt more or less like a man who'd been hungry for many years and now has a huge meal before him, know where to begin, and has a mouth watering. It was tremendously exciting, and an awe and a feeling of mystery kind of enveloped me.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the earliest exemplars of the text of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that we have. When you look at them, some of the books are almost exactly the same as a Hebrew Bible that you would buy in a bookstore. And these scrolls have opened up for us a new world in the history of the biblical text in this period.
What the wolf had uncovered were a number of pottery urns. Inside were many sheets of leather, all covered with Aramaic and Hebrew inscriptions. Thinking the leather might be of you, Mahmud took these scrolls to a shoemaker in Jerusalem. The shoemaker brought them to the attention of the local clergy. Thus began a journey of discovery, savage academic infighting, and madness that has not ended this day. The land near the ancient city of Qumran is the most desolate part of one of the most desolate regions on Earth. An inhospitable place to visit, let alone live. But the city of Qumran was home to a small group of dedicated, some say fanatic, true believers. Perhaps the darkness of this land was a constant reminder of the future they thought was fast approaching. A future where the land would be swept clean by an epic battle between good and evil. That battle was explicitly foretold in their writings, and those writings become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls were written roughly 100 years before the time of Christ and were finished a few decades after his death. This same time in history, Egypt's Cleopatra was beginning a doomed love affair with Mark Antony of Rome, while in Greece, Eratosthenes was suggesting that the earth moves around the sun. The death of Sun Tzu marked the end of China's classical period of philosophy. Sometime in the 1st century after Christ, the Dead Sea Scrolls were buried in earthen jars that would eventually shatter history with the stone's throw of a young boy. But just as the scrolls were being buried almost 2,000 years ago, the New Testament was being assembled, the collection of writings that would forever drive a wedge between Judaism and Christianity.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are important because they tell us about a crucial period between the end of the Hebrew Bible and its story, which ends essentially in about 400 BCE, and the rise of the Judaism that we know, which we essentially call Rabbinic Judaism or Mishnaic Judaism, and of course, the development of Christianity. This stuff fills that hole, which we could term the crossroads in which these important developments occur.
We know that the people of the days of the scrolls really already had more or less 2/3 of what we consider the Bible, that is the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. The last third of it was still sort of up for grabs. What would be in, what would be out. And the scrolls show us a lot of the books that didn't get in, and we start to see something of what the controversies were that occupied the people of the time of Jesus.
Scholars believe that the scrolls were assembled by a strict, uncompromising sect known as the Essenes. Just as many monks around the world practiced their devotion in isolated communities, so it was with the Essenes, who went to these desert caves in order to better serve their beliefs. A few decades after the death of Christ, historian Josephus these words:
The Essenes profess a severe discipline. They are Jews by birth and strangely attached to one another. They see pleasure-seeking as a vice, regard temperance and mastery of the passions as virtues. Contemptuous of wealth, they are communists to perfection.
Josephus, the ancient historian, describes these people as a very peaceful group that dressed themselves in white robes, shared the meals together in a sort of a brotherhood, much like What we read about in the book of Acts for the early Christians, pooled their possessions. They were very much a pacifist group, not interested in war, didn't want to fight.
It would have seemed improbable to the people of the Wadi Qumran that they would be the subject of such intense worldwide study 2,000 years after they were gone. But that's how it would be. And neither the people nor the scrolls they wrote would disappoint a world that was waiting for a possible glimpse of the schism of one great religion into two. Shortly after their discovery, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls made their way to the United States, where, unbelievably, some of these priceless documents were listed for sale in the Wall Street Journal, in what must rank as one of the most amazing and possibly inappropriate classified ads of all time. They were sold to the government of Israel, and in the early 1950s, the scroll documents in the United States were taken back to Jerusalem, where most of them remain today.
The scrolls are full of enormous mysteries. Some of the most basic ones are still occupying my mind. I turn over and over in my mind the question, for example, who wrote the scrolls? How does this new scroll show us a little bit more about that question? How does that one show us? How can they all be put together? It's an enormous jigsaw puzzle that we have to deal with here, historically speaking.
I think the most important thing that people have to realize about the Dead Sea Scrolls is they're not just a couple or a handful. This is an entire library. There are over 800 scrolls.
For the past 40 years, scholars have painstakingly reconstructed this jigsaw puzzle, composed of thousands of tiny fragments, any one of which would dissolve into dust if handled roughly. One of the only clues to putting the scrolls back together is a language lost long ago, and many vital pieces are missing. That is why it is only now, more than 40 years after their discovery, that the scrolls are slowly yielding some of their secrets, and why the interpretation of some of those secrets may be seen as quite controversial.
One of the things that really surprised me when I began to translate the scrolls was a fragment that's come to be known as the pierced Messiah or the dying Messiah. It's been a very controversial fragment, and many of my colleagues like my views on it, but I'm stubborn enough to think they may still be right. It seems to describe a Messiah or a messianic type figure who is being put to death. Now this is, of course, potentially earth-shaking in terms of the study of early Christianity.
Earth-shaking, perhaps. What some scholars are studying is whether the scrolls might have anticipated Christianity, since they were written many years before the birth of Christ. Further studies of the scrolls will undoubtedly reveal more, because they are the clearest window in the men and women of that time, the time when Christianity was about to be born.
He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Luke 1:32.
That is what the Bible tells us an angel's to Mary. It was a prophecy that she would conceive the Messiah. Now listen to these words, written about 100 years before Jesus was born.
He shall be great upon the earth, and shall make peace, and all shall serve him. He shall be called the Son of the great God, and by his name shall he be named. He shall be hailed the Son of God, and shall call him the Son of the Most High, and his kingdom shall be a kingdom forever.
And so a riddle in the scrolls becomes a mystery of the Bible.
One of the things that the scrolls do for us is to give us some idea of the tremendous messianic fervor that existed at that time. The scrolls, to a great extent, and certainly as regards the Dead Sea sect itself, represent a type of catastrophic messianism that expected that there would be a great war, and that after this war, the messianic era would dawn. It would be an era of perfection of a kind that had never existed before.
History suggests that Messianism, the belief that the Messiah is about to arrive, tends to rise in times of hardship or political unrest. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, the Romans were taking over the Holy Land, and times were cruel indeed. It was the century before Jesus was born. The people of Qumran, the likely caretakers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, had predicted the Messiah's coming decades before Jesus was born, and had dedicated their lives to waiting for his arrival. In their writings, they even mention a mysterious, puzzling figure, the teacher of righteousness.
You want to talk about mysteries in the scrolls. One of the big mysteries is this Moreh HaTzedek, the righteous teacher of righteousness. We don't know who he was. There have been so many theories about who he was that they cancel each other out.
One theory that's been propounded, and I think it's a far-out theory, is that the teacher of righteousness, who was mentioned in the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as being the originator and leader of the group. This far-out theory is that he was, in fact, later than most scholars place the teacher of righteousness, and that he was the brother of Jesus, named James the Just. I don't believe it.
Some people have been fearful that the New Testament might have to be rewritten in light of the scrolls, or that Christianity might have to be completely reassessed in light of the materials. My own feeling is that questions like that really cannot be answered by anything that can be found physically. We're talking about matters of faith, and it is my own belief, and my own finding, that such matter not really be affected by what is discovered in an ancient text or in any cavern or dug out of the ground, because faith is resilient enough to encompass almost any new finding.
What the scrolls do give us is a glimpse of one tiny corner of a people faith that was about to be split into two religions that dominate the Western world to this day.
But if you search there for the Lord your God, find him, if only you seek him with all your heart and soul. Deuteronomy 4:40.
Vendell Jones is a man with a mission. This 63-year-old amateur archaeologist is searching against all odds for one of history's most tantalizing treasures, the lost Ark of the Covenant. Here, the Bible tells us, the Israelites kept the two tablets upon which it is believed God himself had inscribed the Ten Commandments. Vendell Jones and his quest for the lost Ark, inspiration for Indiana Jones in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark.
The big difference between that movie and this excavation is that the moved rag as compared to what we're doing here.
The mystery associated with the Ark is not what happened to it or who stole it or how its power was used, but its mystery is in its representation of the divine presence.
If it were to be discovered, it would have been more than a kind of atomic explosion. It's something unbelievable, unpredictable, unbearable. It's impossible.
I'm confident that it doesn't exist. How can I prove it? I can't.
To Vendell Jones and his volunteers, the Ark is real and waiting for them to discover it.
Anytime you can find another thing that indicates you're on the right track. Everybody, we make more dust, we dig faster.
But at what price? The Bible is very clear about what will happen to anyone other than the Hebrew high priests of old who would touch the Holy Ark.
They shall become like walking corpses, their flesh rotting away. Their eyes will shrivel in their sockets, and their tongues will decay in their mouths. Zechariah 14:12.
It was surrounded by a taboo. It was forbidden to approach it, excluding those people who had the prerogative of handling it. These were the priests, the servants of God. Now, the Bible knows to relate that there were laymen, simple folk who gazed into the ark and they were killed immediately.
The founding of Israel took place in a distant time which seems almost mythical, but which it is increasingly clear is history much as the Bible tells it. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in a cave at the lowest spot on earth in 1947, we can see that the Bible has changed very little in more than 2,000 years. And it seems that almost every day some new archaeological discovery confirms yet another biblical story. It is through the Bible that we can return to the beginning of the recorded history of Judaism and meet those visionaries, rulers, philosophers, and military leaders who gave birth to a nation and were forced to watch it destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Their names are legendary. Abraham, Moses, Solomon, David.
Abraham, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will show you. Genesis 22:2. God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Exodus 3:4. King Solomon loved many strange women. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:1. David put his hand in the bag, and took thence a stone, and slung it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell to the earth upon his face. 1 Samuel 17:33.
The Hebrew slave revolt in Egypt took place during the so-called New Kingdom, a 500-year period which was the cultural and artistic height of the Egyptian Empire. It was at this time that many of the great pharaohs created enduring monuments to themselves and their gods, monuments built by Hebrew slaves who were about to revolt and meet their destiny in the nearby Sinai Desert. One of these slaves was Moses, an immortal leader who would guide his people to freedom and change the course of history. According to the Bible, Moses was following a calling.
I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. Exodus 3:8.
It was approximately 1,400 years before the birth of Christ when the legendary Hebrew exodus from Egypt occurred, and the laws communicated by Moses were about to be handed down. At this same moment in history, Egypt was setting down regulations concerning the sale of beer. The Phoenicians were importing tin from mines in England, and China was using silk fabrics for the first time. and issuing a dictionary. The legacy Moses conveyed for all time were the 5 books of Moses, which we know as the Old Testament. It contained one of history's first legal systems and the seeds of modern democracy. But the centerpiece of these 5 books was so special, Moses brought them down from Mount Sinai himself. These were the 10 Commandments, and a holy ark was built to house them.
The Ark is a fascinating aspect of biblical culture because it represents the solution for the Israelites of a problem. We as human beings find it difficult in some ways to worship something that we can't see, something that's invisible. And the Ark helps bridge the gap between the invisible God and the material world.
These 2 tablets of Moses were to be housed in the Ark of the Covenant, an ark so special and holy that the Bible is highly specific about its design. The Bible's description should help those looking for the ark.
Make an ark, a chest of acacia wood 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. Overlay it with pure gold both inside and out. Cast 4 gold rings for it, and fasten them to its 4 feet, 2 rings on each side. Make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. Insert the poles into the rings at the sides of the ark to lift it. Exodus 25:10.
I think one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the Ark of the Covenant was exactly what it was and what it was for. It seems to have been a very ancient part of Hebrew religion, somehow signifying the definite presence of God. Some kind of movable shrine, movable symbol, which was not to say that God was only there, but some kind of movable symbol suggesting that God was definitely here.
The next time we hear of the ark is in the Promised Land, when Joshua led the Hebrews in an assault against the walled city of Jericho. It is said the ark was hoisted aloft, indicating God's presence for all to see. And then the horns blew, and the walls came tumbling down.
The Bible describes some things that happen with respect to the ark. There are narratives about it which seem to give it magical properties. It seems to represent God's presence in a very powerful way. And I suppose the idea is that if this ark were somehow still in existence or could be recovered, that people who believe these stories in a particular kind of way might then have access to God's power in a more direct or more immediate way than they do otherwise.
In the earliest historical and biblical records, the ark rested here in the ancient city of Shiloh during the 13th or 14th century before the birth of Christ. It then slowly made its way 15 miles south to the city of Jerusalem, where it would rest for close to 800 years. It was at this time that King Solomon built the first temple, where the Holy Ark was the centerpiece of worship. It would also be now that one of the most famous love stories of all time took place, and where any search for the Ark must pause. The search for the lost ark takes us down an unlikely byway at the time of Solomon, ancient king of Israel, renowned for his wisdom.
One says, "The live one is my son, the dead one is yours." And the other says, "No, the dead child is yours, the live child is mine." And Solomon said, "Fetch me a sword and cut the live child in two, and give half to one and half to the other." 1 Kings 3:23.
This is the fabled Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. To Jews everywhere, it is one of the most sacred sites. Here is where the Holy Ark of the Covenant came to rest. At that time, the kingdom of Israel was a turbulent place. There were palace intrigues, attempted coups, and because of Israel's unfortunate location, constant warfare.
It was an unfortunate coincidence that the Hebrews would be located where they are. They're located at what can only be called a land bridge between the two great centers of civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Therefore, instead of being a quiet, tranquil corner of the world, they basically existed in the grand central station of the ancient world. So therefore, in order to control the major trade routes, in order to control the major routes whereby you could move armies, you had to control the land of Palestine, which happened to also be where the tribes of Israel were located. Consequently, that got them into a lot of trouble.
In order to cement the bonds of peace, Solomon followed the traditional path of marrying the daughters of potential rivals. All of their names are lost to history, except one, a woman who captivated Solomon and the authors of the Old Testament. According to the 10th chapter of the Book of Kings, Sheba came to Jerusalem.
She arrived in Jerusalem with a very large retinue, with camels bearing spices, a great quantity of gold and precious stones. And when the Queen of Sheba observed all of Solomon's wisdom, and the palace he had built, and the fare of his table, she was left breathless. 1 Kings 10:2.
There's a wonderful story in the Book of Kings about Solomon and a woman from a foreign place, the so-called Queen of Sheba story. And this is a story that allows us to see several important ideas or motifs associated with one of the most famous biblical kings, that is Solomon. Who was this queen who came to Jerusalem? We really don't know very much about her, and we're not even sure that this is actually an historical account.
The connection of Solomon and Sheba is an interesting issue. It's an interesting story. We know that Solomon was famous for cementing a lot of alliances through the marriage of foreign wives. The Bible is a bit critical of Solomon on that, I might add, that perhaps he mixed with too many foreign women.
King Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Phoenician, and Hittite women. 1 Kings 11:1.
She comes to him because she's heard of how wise he is. The word wisdom is used a number of times in that story. She doesn't believe anybody could be as smart as Solomon's reputation has him being. So she comes and she asks him riddles, and she does various things to test his wisdom. He passes with flying colors. So his wisdom is reinforced, is reiterated, is highlighted by this story. He deserves all the credit he should get for being a wise ruler.
One interesting facet of the Solomon and Sheba story is that we may be reading about one of history's earliest interracial romances. This would certainly be part of Ethiopian tradition, where Sheba is believed to have been an early monarch. But not all scholars are convinced. Nevertheless, it is possible that the Queen of Sheba was black.
She's probably not an African queen, although the Ethiopians claim her as theirs. Most likely she comes from somewhere in South Arabia. And there's a kingdom, the kingdom of Saba in Arabia, which may be related linguistically to the word Sheba. And it's probably a better bet that she was a Semitic queen and not an African queen.
In any event, from what the Bible tells us, it seems that there was a chemical reaction between Solomon and Sheba.
In addition to what he gave her out of his royal bounty, King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all that she desired. 1 Kings 10:13.
It is here that the search for the lost ark takes an unlikely turn. To the south, to Ethiopia, to the tiny village of Aksum, some 350 miles north of the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. For according to Ethiopian tradition, the union of Solomon and Sheba resulted in a son named Menelik I. According to the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's ancient and sacred document, Menelik spirited the Holy Ark out of Jerusalem as the destruction of the Holy Temple loomed near.
If anyone would have had connections with a kingdom as far away as Northern Africa, Solomon seems an excellent candidate, because the Hebrew nation never saw a greater time of civilization, of accomplishment, than it did under Solomon.
Anyone who has visited Ethiopia or traveled around Ethiopia can't help but be intrigued by Ethiopian culture and the country's great history. And when you go to Aksum, you can stand in a part of the town where you are surrounded by the relics of 3 or 4 periods of Ethiopian history, churches, fields of carved granite obelisks, and this tiny little chapel. Whether you believe that the true ark is in this building or not, the belief of the Ethiopians in the holiness of this place is simply overwhelming.
If the Holy Ark escaped, whether to Ethiopia or some other place, any such journey would have begun in 587 BC. It was at this time, in the 6th century before Christ, that Jerusalem fell. Solomon's holy temple was set aflame and looted, its magnificent objects of worship scattered to the winds. It was also at this time that a young man, thousands of miles from Jerusalem, was leaving his home in northern India. It was the 6th century before Christ, a time when new schools of faith and thought seemed to be blossoming everywhere. The young man in India was about to preach his first sermon in the holy city of Benares. His name was Buddha, and he would enlighten followers with the knowledge that the difficulties of life may be overcome by lowering one's sense of self-importance. Meanwhile, in China, a gentleman named Kung Fu Tse would teach a philosophy of personal virtue, devotion to family, and social justice. The Western world would come to know him as Confucius. It was also at this time that the first olive tree was brought to Italy by the ancient Greeks, while in their own country, the civil rights of Greek women were being taken away. In Jerusalem, Solomon's temple may have been in ruins, but the Holy Ark itself may have escaped. Perhaps Menelik took the Ark to Africa, But it is also possible that the temple priests spirited out the greatest treasures just before the final assault and buried them.
The Bible has a certain report of all the whereabouts which were connected with this object from its initiation on Mount Sinai down to its introduction into the Temple of Solomon immediately after the temple had been built. But later on, there is a total silence.
There are some who believe that history may not have been entirely silent about the whereabouts of the lost ark, that a distant voice speaking to us from across time may yet give us clues. A voice from the desert dwelling of Qumran, home of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the 800 documents found at Qumran was made entirely of copper, after painstakingly separating 2,000-year-old copper sheets rolled together. Scholars and adventurers were amazed and excited, for what the copper scroll seemed to contain was a treasure map, which showed where the riches of the Holy Temple were hidden away from the invading Romans.
No one has ever found any of the treasures listed in the Copper Scroll. I don't think that's particularly surprising, and it doesn't mean that the scroll doesn't list real treasure. Because we know that the Romans, who took control of the temple, tortured out of the treasurers the locations of at least some of the treasures of the temple at that time. And I think the Romans probably got it all.
But Vendell Jones is not so sure. He has been using this copper scroll map as a guide to his diggings. He believes that it points the way to the ultimate treasure of the lost Holy Ark. Jones also believes the Ark is located in the very same caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Miraculously, he has found some lost treasure from the time of Solomon's temple, and he believes it is only a matter of time before the Ark is found.
I think that's one of the things that's made the mystery of the Ark of the Covenant so enticing to so many people. Because the Ark has never been found, because its physical presence isn't there to contradict people's expectations and people's feelings about it, its power as a symbol is enhanced. Its potency as a mystery is that much stronger.
The Holy Ark is just one of the treasures scattered to the winds on a long ago day in 587 BC. And it may or may not be revealed whether the Ark resides in a small country church in Ethiopia, or was destroyed by man or nature, or perhaps is still buried in the timeless sands of the Middle East.
And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. Isaiah 2:4.
Like so many mysteries in the Bible, perhaps the world peace foretold in Isaiah chapter 2 will arrive with the final coming of the Messiah. Or maybe we won't have to wait that long. Perhaps the existence of God could be proved if we all got to witness the miracles of the Exodus, or those performed by a humble preacher at the Sea of Galilee. Perhaps the Old and New Testaments will yield all their mysteries, given enough time. Perhaps.
Archaeology doesn't deal with the essential truth of the Bible in that way, but it does make the biblical world come alive for us. It does give flesh and bones to the bare words of a text, and it enriches it for us, and then can bring us all much closer to the biblical world. For a lot of people, that's very important.
I don't think that what you call the mysteries are likely to be resolved. They're eternal mysteries. Sometimes when scholarship says that some beliefs are not historically precisely the way they're described in the Bible, I think that troubles people. But it also enriches our understanding of a real past, so that it has its good side, and for some people, unsettling side.
Part of the continuing fascination with the Bible, it seems to me, is precisely the fact that we will never solve all of the questions, all of the mysteries that are involved in biblical studies. It's also a reason why I'm fairly confident about my own job, because there will always be these kind of mysteries, and there will always be open questions as a part of doing biblical studies.
There will probably be mysteries that just won't be resolved. And that's part of the depth of the book. If there weren't any mysteries in Shakespeare, who would be interested in reading it?
The more we probe, the more the Bible seems to be an accurate reflection of history. And yet, as it turns out, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls have raised more questions than answers. They continue to be studied around the world in an effort to get closer and closer to a time and a people that existed long ago.
The Bible is constantly being reinterpreted, and I think that the discovery of the scrolls will enhance that process. We always learning new things through archaeology, and then we have to reinterpret a passage that helps. And so naturally, the Bible is constantly being reinterpreted.
There's no question in my mind that we're really just at the beginning of understanding the mysteries of the scrolls, or what the scroll writers themselves would call the razim, the mysteries. We just understand so little about these people and the most basic of questions, and compound that with the probability, I think, in my own mind at least, that we're going to find more manuscript materials in those caves out there in the desert. I think the mysteries are just beginning.
Did you intend for your words to survive the ages? Is that why you took such...
Message, and it really be affected, in my own view, by archaeology, either positively or negatively.
The Holy Land has withstood 4,000 years of war. Jerusalem, its holiest, blessed city, still remains as a reminder to all of the spiritual. On its streets, it seems that ghosts of past inhabitants walk the paths always walked, sharing their secrets with no one. They have power, but their word remains. In the beginning, created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. At then, we find ourselves at the beginning, confronted by the wonder of the book and its never-ending